Today we're going to be sitting down with Dr. Damien King, who is, I would say, a famous Caribbean economist based here in Jamaica. You're the executive director of CAPRI, the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. You authored and co-authored a number of papers promoting the policy, including things related to, in my opinion, tax reform and a number of other things that apply to not just Jamaica, but developmental economics. Can you tell us a little bit about CAPRI before we dive into the discussion?
Yes, thank you, David. It's really a pleasure to be here. CAPRI arises from a realization, from articulating a realization that all of us have really had, that are old enough to reflect upon Jamaica's development. And it is that Jamaica has disappointed us developmentally. We all had more optimism for what Jamaica was going to become, especially around independence in the 1960s. That there was a great deal, there was a feeling that Jamaica had a lot of economic potential. And when you look at 50 odd years since independence, mostly what you see is a country that at best, in many respects, has stagnated. And in some respects actually deteriorated. Now, given the advantages it seemed to have, it had a decent educational system, it is in the middle of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, it's close to a big market, no history of, centuries old ethnic conflict. It's hard to explain this underperformance. And we came to the appreciation that its policy-making apparatus was weak. That the public bureaucracy did not have sufficient technical capacity to inform policy-making and to give our political leaders the feasible options. And so we formed a think tank which was to assist with that problem. It was to provide knowledge and recommendations on public policy issues. And that's what we've done for a dozen years.
Oh, well, and trust me, I've read them, as many as possible, and I'm glad to see scholarly research being done and not just writing an article in the newspaper and having people who are what I consider armchair economists giving their own opinions. So I love that you bring up the stagnation or the underachievement of Jamaica. Jamaica, as most of us know, we talk about our outsized impact on the world, whether it's reggae music and our contribution there, or we're going to talk about track and field. But somehow we have not measured up to the growth around the globe, and definitely not within emerging economies. You touch on that stagnation and the shipping lanes and our location to a close market. And a lot of us grew up thinking about Singapore. We look at Israel, if you read the book Startup Nation, they've had some amazing growth. And they're even emerging economies in Latin America. What are some of the reasons you think Jamaica hasn't done as well?
Well, it's clear that along the way, we made some significant policy errors. And so, because of that, and because we consistently made policy errors, we were not able to leverage the advantage and the resources that the country was blessed with.
So, do you think part of that reason for making those policy errors is that resource curse that we hear about when you look at especially African countries? Jamaica has a lot of land, and so we kind of waste it, or that's not necessarily part of the reason?
I mean, that may very well have been a part of it. It is significant that the poster child for economic development in the last half century, Singapore, has no resources.
Right.
Not even water. You can't find a river. And therefore, if there is going to be any consumption in Singapore, if there's going to be any government revenue, it has to be out of created wealth.
Right.
So not having resources tends to sharpen the focus and to punish a bad policy environment.
So when we look at those countries that have had outside success, I know we can't just copy and paste from Singapore or Israel or Chile and stick it into Jamaica. We have to have local context. But they all seem to have invested in education as a major thing. India is a really good example of that. China now. We have to have a healthy population that goes to work. I think healthcare is something that we need to look at. And then they need security. The population needs to be secure, and that includes transportation. It seems though that all those things help them with productivity. And every time I've read about Jamaica and our economic growth, whether it's stagnant or now we have record numbers, which record is 1.4%, that's not 5 and 10. Mm-hmm. What are some of those issues? Are we putting in the effort to invest in the health, security, and education? Am I correct to think that those are key foundations, or is there something else that I am missing?
I mean, the issue of how to get economic growth and how to sustain it is elusive and not subject to a simple formula. Because if it were, then all countries would grow rapidly and become wealthy. But there are some things that we do know, and you've mentioned some of them. You need to invest in the productive capacity of the country. That's the starting point. It may not be a sufficient condition, that's debatable, but it is certainly a necessary condition. And that productive capacity has to do with, first and foremost, education. You need to have a population with a good foundation of education that creates not only the ability to be productive, but the ability to be adaptable as new technologies come along. You need to invest in the health of the population. A healthy population allows the members of the population to invest in themselves. You need to invest in the economic infrastructure. That means you have a good road network for the transportation of people and the transportation of cargo. It's interesting that Jamaica so underinvested in infrastructure in the post-independence period that all of the traffic between the capital city and the north coast came down at one point to a bridge consisting of one lane, not one lane in each direction, one lane for both directions at the flat bridge. That was built 300 years ago for horses. And when the obvious infrastructural bottleneck became apparent many years ago, the solution was a traffic light. The solution was, well, somebody have to wait. It took us 300 years to build a north-south highway to break that bottleneck. So we're vastly underinvested in the economic infrastructure. The same thing can be said about the water infrastructure in Kingston, the freshwater infrastructure, where every time we don't rain for a few days, we have to put up with restrictions on lockups. A safe and secure and orderly environment so people feel their persons and their property are secure. That incentivizes investment. If you don't think that you or your property are secure, you're not going to invest. So those basic foundations of productive capacity were not invested in sufficiently. That was our main failure. On top of that, we pretty badly managed our fiscal affairs for most of those 50 years. And we have gone through regular cycles of either punishingly high public debt. We had an episode in the late 1980s, we had an episode in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which has continued up to recently. Or we had high inflation, which is actually a twin to high debt. Because essentially when you badly manage your fiscal affairs, your fiscal accounts, then the difference is either borrowed or printed. If you borrow it, you have high debt. If you print it, you have high inflation. So bad fiscal management was another element of it. But essentially, these basic failures of economic management, failure to invest in the infrastructure and the capacity for a productive economy, and bad fiscal management is what has helped Jamaica.
And so, I like that you bring up the cycles that we've gone through. So I'm born in 1981. I now realize that there's an entire generation that does not know about the 1990s financial crisis in Jamaica. And having worked in finance since that, I saw something that was similar to what had happened in the United States in the past. We've had something in Asia as well. That gave us a lot more debt. Having the government have to bail out a number of banks and fail life insurance policy companies, gave us massive debt overhang. So it wasn't just that we wasted money on the infrastructure side. We taxed and then we had to borrow. We had to then bail out people, which then added to the debt. And we had, absurd inflation, as I can see. But then we have now turned a corner, it seems. We went through I'm not more of IMF these, we can't even say two. We've gone to the IMF a number of times. We did 2 debt exchanges, and it seems that Jamaica is now a model for how to actually essentially deal with our debt overhang, bringing our debt to GDP ratio down from somewhere in the 147% range to just below 100. I'm told we're heading to 60 within 3 years. We have a lot of Jamaicans overseas that left, and they have not been paying attention to this. What would you tell them is different, and why this is the last 5 years are shaping a different Jamaica than what they remember when they left?
It's difficult to overstate the transformation in policy making and approach to policy making that has taken place in Jamaica over the last 5 to 6 years. We had a situation up to then when Jamaica has struggled to create an economy that is stable enough. Stable in not having high inflation. Stable in not having high debt. Stable in not having to worry about that the exchange rate 6 months from now could be any number you could pick out of the air. Stable in not having to worry about panic and capital flight. That could be any more than 4 weeks away. Right? That there was so much government debt that the threat of default was ever present. Starting 6 years ago, the government wrestled with our fiscal problem. Right. And we went from having a fiscal deficit, which is an excess of expenditure over revenue, and we measure these things in relation to GDP, in relation to total output. So the government's fiscal deficit, government's fiscal gap, averaged 6% of GDP for a dozen years since the start of this century. And to emphasize how bad that is, what we are saying is that for a dozen years, the government continued to overspend or undertax by roughly 6% of GDP, and a dozen years in which they were already so highly indebted that we were the 3rd most indebted country in the world. And even though we were only the 3rd most indebted, we were number 1 in terms of the cost of debt service to our population. Now, 6 years later, the government's debt has come down from nearly 150% of GDP to less than 100%. Off of the top of my head, I can't think of any other country that has achieved that scale of public debt reduction without having defaulted on external debt or offered debt relief on external debt. Right. So it is an exercise in fiscal consolidation done by the country. It is very easy for people to hang that achievement upon 2 excuses. One is that, well, we couldn't, we're in crisis. We couldn't go on like we were anymore. Right. Well, actually, we've been in crisis since 2000. And we very well went on like that. Okay? 2012 was not the beginning of a fiscal crisis. So, it's not because it could not have gone anymore. Secondly, people say that, well, it was because of the IMF. The IMF has been in Jamaica on and off since 1977. If the IMF was a solution, we'd never have gotten into the problem in the first place. Which is not to say that the did not play a critical role. But it was a critical role that they were willing to play in every previous agreement that Jamaica did not adhere to. So take no credit away from two successive administrations now that have exercised responsibility and implemented difficult economic reform. But beginning 6 years ago, that process began of fiscal consolidation and improved fiscal management.
Right.
We went from a deficit of a fiscal accounts imbalance of 6% of GDP to a roughly balanced budget in 1 year flat. And we have maintained more or less balanced government accounts since then. In addition to that, the management of monetary policy has improved. Our inflation rate over the last 4 years has been less than 5% every year. We have improved in the ease of opening and doing business, which has been reflected in our improved score in the World Bank's Doing Business Index. And we have invested heavily in infrastructure, in the physical infrastructure,
right.
highway construction and road expansions. All of which has improved the climate for doing business in Jamaica. And you see now, 6 years later, this showing up in the macroeconomic statistics. So I mentioned inflation is down. Employment has gone up by about 100,000 jobs in the last 5 years. The unemployment rate, which was over 15% at the start of this exercise, has now come down to less than 8%, which is a record low unemployment for Jamaica. Investment is booming, and you don't need to look at the national accounts data to see it. You can drive around Kingston and around Montego Bay and you physically see it. Yeah. You see the construction cranes. Now, so what we see is an improved economic and business environment, and businesses taking advantage of that. And a lot of anecdotal evidence that businesses are expanding and are optimistic. So Jamaica is different and improving in many ways. This is the beginning of the journey. As I said, economic growth is an elusive thing. We are yet to see this incipient improvement translate into headline economic growth in terms of the GDP numbers.
Right.
And risks remain. We're still a highly vulnerable economy. We're one good category 5 away from having a difficult fiscal situation to manage again, even though we have more fiscal room now. As everybody appreciates, crime and insecurity continues to be a constraint and a concern. Right. And that improvement in employment is starting to be a constraint itself. That we don't seem to have either the numbers or the skill levels to be able to sustain rapid economic growth.
Right.
But all that apart, the sense of what is happening in Jamaica's economy is quite different and looks like it has some legs.
So.